And I want to just conclude this lecture by saying a couple more things more generally about Merleau-Ponty's philosophy. It Again, I said this before, but he wears many hats at different times, and he is a phenomenologist. He's also a psychologist. He held the chair of child psychology. And he's a philosopher and a historian. And he is also a literary critic, I guess you could call it, or a consumer of literature. He's a lover of literature and of art. And so he is an artist, he's a scientist, and he's a naturalist, not in the sense of reductive naturalism, but in the sense of someone who loves nature and spends time in nature. In the classical prejudice of Western thought, there's this division between art, science, philosophy, and that division is highly problematic and highly flawed in so many ways, and leads us to this kind of separated abstract view of nature and humanity versus nature. All of that is encapsulated in this these problematic views of nature from history in Western thought. Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology remains centered in these three realities. He uses all three as evidence to understand consciousness, and develops each himself. Like, he does art, he does science, he does nature. He does nature. Well, he is in nature, and he does philosophy. So these things are integrated. He has an integral approach to them, and he develops them in an embodied way, and embodiment and intellect are integrated in a fundamental way that really no one in the Western philosophical tradition had as successfully done. People had done it to some degree, but Merleau-Ponty really stands out as one of these amazing integral thinkers, and putting these ideas to work for himself in the way he approaches phenomenological investigation. So, again, nature is an event of sense-making. It is not separate from the sense-making of our consciousness. So science, has been taken as this kind of apprehension or insight into truth. And art has been considered as a kind of invention, a kind of creation, and a kind of integration. So, science shouldn't be making sense and inventing, but art shouldn't just be having an insight into truth. So these things should be separated. That's the classical view of them. But phenomenology as a type of philosophy, as an approach to philosophy, necessarily has to embody all of these, necessarily has to integrate all of these. It can't be reduced. Phenomenology cannot be reduced to a static historical concept. So we have phenomenology in the Husserlian tradition, which Merleau-Ponty takes up and extends, but we should not view, in the same way that we wouldn't say like European art or European philosophy is utterly different from philosophy in other places, or the reflection on human life in other places, or the creation of things and the expressive tendency of humans in other cultural contexts, right? So phenomenology is not restricted to Husserlian phenomenology. Phenomenological philosophy, and this is something Husserl himself says, is always beginning again. And I've said this already, and I'll repeat it. Philosophy is always beginning. It's something we must begin to do. It's something we begin reflecting phenomenologically. And even once we've become seasoned phenomenologists, we must begin again. The phenomenologist is a perpetual beginner. Something that's taken up again and reevaluated. We must begin for ourselves. You cannot have someone begin phenomenologically investigating for you. You must begin phenomenologically investigating, and you must always begin again. And even Merleau-Ponty in his later life kind of rejects some of the earlier ideas. You see the same thing in Husserl and Heidegger and in Sartre. Every phenomenologist begins again. And even in Derrida, he says, I'm not even a phenomenologist anymore. Well, most people say, most readers of Derrida and understanding the trajectory from where he comes, sees him as really just fulfilling this aspect of Husserl. We must begin again, right? So we must reinvent phenomenology over and over again. And that aspect of science gets kind of painted over. We have this idea of paradigm shifts in science. And a paradigm shift is a reintegration. It's a recasting or a reinventing of science, right? So every paradigm shift involves this kind of reinvention. So phenomenology has to be like science. It has to be like art. And as a form of philosophy, it's integrating these different tendencies. Our renewed beginnings, our attempts and reflections, each time constitute the science of phenomenology. They make the science of phenomenology. Something which occurs in each of us, in our lives, and it institutes a certain attitude and a sort of sense-making in us. Phenomenology does not exist in a library. It does not exist on the internet. It does not exist in a body of knowledge or in texts or anything like that. It exists when we begin doing it, when we undertake it, when we take it up for ourselves, when we describe, when we discover, when we investigate. And we have to constantly improve our method. Husserl repeats this over and over again throughout his work, and shows this kind of feedback, positive feedback that exists between the method and the improvement of the method, the reinvention of the method, right? So phenomenology evolves and is going to be different in everyone, although it always is going to touch on certain relations and facts. The figure-background relationship, this transcendental structure, it appears differently in every context, and the way in which we describe it as, primary background, that's going to be shifting. But the very structure itself of consciousness, the very fact that we're conscious in order to do phenomenology, that's going to be the same always. And how that sameness is translated into language, that's going to be a huge problem that we're going to have to dive deeper into and try to avoid some of these classical hang-ups, universal or nominalism, these kinds of problems. But we'll get into that more later. Last thing I want to say is that Merleau-Ponty has an earth-honoring philosophy. I think that this really comes through, it's going to come through more, but it really comes through in his critiques of these classical prejudices. And these classical prejudices, there's theoretical problems with them, but they also motivate climate destruction, colonialism, all types of exploitative behaviors by treating the world as a kind of thing, a static, inert, manipulatable thing. So Merleau-Ponty elevates and releases the body from this mechanistic static paradigm of science and those traditions of, body despising. The body is folded into the flesh of the world, and we'll talk about more what that means later, but that's an elevation of the body. The body is nature. It's not separate from nature. And nature is being elevated by Merleau-Ponty as well, as something expressive and something deeply meaningful. The body and our embodied consciousness is, it's something that's in the background, and we make it into the foreground with our consciousness, but it is really part of that background. It's a fold in nature. It's part of this flesh of the background of all of our perceptions. And our consciousness is a lacuna. It's a gap in this fabric of nature as a causal matrix, everything mutually acting on each other, it interrupts that mechanistic thing, the mechanistic thingliness of nature. Merleau-Ponty says that we're the flaw in the diamond. So we're the little flaw within the diamond. If the diamond is perfect because every part is mutually determining of the others, we're the flaw in the diamond that allows there to be freedom and subjectivity and consciousness. Consciousness breaks the linearity of mechanistic causality and its linear temporality, and it ruptures this materialistic historical sense of things. There's an emergence of novel organizations, of norms, of relations, and potentialities, most of all potentialities. And there's transformations of consciousness that are not historic, mechanistic, reductive emergences. So the earth is the ground from which all meaning emerges. So it's an earth honoring philosophy in the highest sense. It makes that ultimate background, the background of all backgrounds, the genesis of meaning. And meaning is the most meaningful thing that we can have. So far from being an inert stuff, nature, the earth, is alive with meaning. And all our nature, or all of our knowledge, is a project of the world and a project of nature. It's something in and of the world, engaged with the world, and its meaning is ultimately inseparable from that gestalt.